Dead Air, written by Jonathan Dunne, narrated for you by the author. Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns originally appeared as a character in Jonathan's horror novel Fireman, 2024. Life began for beautiful, blue-eyed, bouncing baby Blake Pierce in Limerick City's maternity hospital in 1985, and ended for bloodshot-eyed, withered, trembling Mr. Burns in 2023 at the Hillside Psychiatric Hospital. Hospital's bookended Blake, aka Mr. Burns' brief time on planet Earth. During those 38 years, Blake came into contact with someone or something that altered his life's path without him ever realizing it, until he cannibalized himself with the raging, out-of-control flames, until he became part of his art. People considered Blake an average Oldcastle teenager. He had a small, tight group of friends, and they loved to cycle around town and beyond on their BMX bikes, though not too far beyond the town limits of Oldcastle, because only the locals knew all wasn't as it seemed in town. Maybe that was reason enough to cycle as far beyond the town limits as possible, but for some odd reason, the locals believed that keeping it in was better than keeping it out. His group of friends were stuck riding BMX bikes when they had fallen out of fashion long ago. Blake had a Fireballer BMX, and his bike had those hardened plastic yellow rims. It was the coolest bike in town, and Blake loved to cycle over Coke cans, crushing them onto his front wheel and watching as the cans jammed in the fork of the BMX, vibrating as if he were driving some kind of dystopian science fiction vehicle. At least that's how it seemed to the innocent 15-year-old. A late Friday afternoon in July 2000 stole that innocence. One Friday evening, during the endless summer that year, the BMX gang went into the local junk shop, Lost and Found on Churchtown Road, to speak to the proprietor, Mr. Cecil McIntyre, or Cess to friends. Most of the shop held knickknacks, but there was a glass display case by the counter that held some mysteries for the teenagers. They enjoyed Cecil's stories about how his trinkets came to be in the shop, often acquired from estates and yard sales. Cecil purchased many of those collectible items at bargain prices because he was shrewd, and the seller didn't realize what they had in their possession. He told this to the boys, adding, "I'm not scamming people. It's called business. What's one man's trash is another man's treasure." While the boys listened to Cecil's tales of wisdom and how he gained these museum artifacts, in the boy's eyes, Blake Pierce stared at a trinket on the other side of the glass. It was a new piece. He was sure of it. He would have noticed something like that before. "Oh, what's that?" "What's what?" Cecil asked. The teenager tapped on the display case. "There, between the kaleidoscope," Mr. McIntyre prompted with a drone that suggested it wasn't the first time he'd had to remind someone how to pronounce the tricky word. "Yeah, between that and the glass skull." Blake pointed to a small stone figurine, seemingly irrelevant at first glance, until one really looked at it and saw the horror etched into the red, rusty stone. But the Pierce boy had a keen eye, and Cecil told him as much. Later that night, while he sat at the bar in the Hound, nursing a creamy pint of Guinness, Cecil would suddenly recall the odd look that had come over young Pierce's face. He stared blankly into the frothy head of Guinness in the pint glass and saw the teenager's round, pale face as he looked at the demon on the other side of the glass. It was a striking expression, and if asked to describe it, Cecil probably wouldn't be able to. Suffice it to say that the lad seemed to be dumbstruck, panic-stricken, and in awe all at once. It was the most peculiar expression Mr. McIntyre had ever seen on the face of anyone looking into the face of the demon. and since the curiosity had come into his possession, he had seen a few expressions turn in its direction during its brief stay at his premises. Whatever it was about that orangey red stone, it had a way of calling people, and he had seen that with his own 2 eyes. But the look on that young man's face earlier today beat the band, as his old man might have said once upon a time. It was quite a peculiar reaction, a reaction he would recall just weeks from now, and wonder if he could have done anything differently. Maybe all the Pierce boy needed was someone to listen to him. Never in a million years would Mr. McIntyre have thought that he was directly responsible for Blake's change in character. Then again, Cecil couldn't be blamed for what would happen because, at the end of the day, fate would intervene between Blake Pierce and the demonic figurine. The junk shop proprietor would be more of a middleman. Cecil went on. Nobody seems to know much about it, so I christened it myself. I call it the Demon, plain and simple, because isn't that what it is? On hearing the word demon, the other boys turned their noses from the glass case to consider Mr. McIntyre, maybe waiting for a snigger or a glint in his eye. But the stony expression on the shop proprietor's face told them this was no joke. They turned to the little statuette of a demonic creature, crouching on his hind legs while short arms flailed like those of a Tyrannosaurus rex, spewing what appeared to be flames. Its wings hugged its body like a roosting fruit bat's leathery wings. Cecil went on to explain how that little figurine had come from the house of an archaeologist. Turner was his name, who had passed away recently and had worked in Egypt for many years. The archaeologist must have picked this up along the way, somewhere in the infernal heat of the desert. The piece captivated Blake Pierce, and soon he was asking, "How much do you want for it?" Mr. McIntyre told Blake he couldn't afford the piece, adding, "This is a genuine occult artifact." Cecil wasn't sure how much the thing was worth, if it was worth anything at all, but the weight of the piece and the aura it gave off told him it was valuable. He just hadn't gotten around to researching such pieces and the prices they fetched on the open market, or black market. He had seen similar amulets down through the years, and there was no limit to what the occult freaks would pay on the black market for stuff like this. And he used that word freaks, as Mr. McIntyre wasn't very politically correct. "But I'll tell you what I'll do for you, kid. I'll hold on to it for you. If you promise me you can come up with the cash, let's say an even €100, I'll put a reserve sign on this instant." Mr. McIntyre made a vague spitting gesture on the palm of his hand. "Deal?" He held his hand out. All eyes were on Blake, who took the junk shop proprietor's hand and shook it proudly. Blake promised Mr. McIntyre, "I'll work at home, odd jobs, that kind of thing." "Odd jobs?" Cecil repeated as he placed a little sign with "reserved" on it next to the figurine. "How many jobs are you going to do around your house to make up €100? We could be here for the next 5 years waiting for your money. Can't keep the sign up on the item forever. I need to make a living, son. I have an idea. I need someone to dust the articles, keep the place tidy. How about you come down a few evenings a week? We'll work out details. If you keep your head down, you'll have your money in a month, tops." Thrilled with the idea, Blake agreed without hesitation. His parents were relieved and happy that he had found a job. They thought it was a wonderful idea. Mr. McIntyre hiring Blake overjoyed his parents, provided he kept up his schoolwork and chores. Grounding and routine were the words his father used, while his mother used key words like responsibility, pocket money, and most importantly, the social aspect, as she felt her son needed to come out of his shell. That would prove to be an understatement. 2. A month later, Cecil McIntyre, lost and found junk shop proprietor, was sitting with other patrons on high stools at the Hound. He was slugging down his creamy pint of Guinness, keeping to himself, when one of the other patrons further up the bar mentioned the Pierce boy. The moment he heard that surname, his insides surged. He was sitting at the bar in the Hound, but could have easily been on a roller coaster. He cleared his throat and pretended he didn't hear the question, then turned back to his newspaper. "Old Cess, yoo-hoo! I know you heard me down there, darling," came the cackle of a voice again. It belonged to old Janie King, who kept this place afloat during the week when the other punters were at home saving money. Cecil took a deep breath and raised his reading glasses onto his ruddy, balding head. He knew this was coming, and to be honest, he felt lucky to have dodged any questions regarding the Pierce lad up until now. It was time to bite the bullet. So he pulled down that same mask he donned when throwing out high prices to innocent customers. But on second thoughts, he raised that imaginary mask and spoke from the heart. Why? Because Blake deserved it, despite his funny turn, which wasn't so funny. But before he opened his mouth on the topic, he quickly scanned the bar for any sign of the local police sergeant, Big Tom Daly, who was known to haunt this place on the weekends. He wasn't sure what he could and couldn't say in the eyes of the law, so he decided to say everything. If he wasn't on his third pint, he mightn't have been so confident. He was a bloody great worker, afraid of nothing, and never asked for anything. A self-sufficient type. We need more of them in this country. Upstarters is the term you're looking for, added someone along the counter. This was quickly followed up with, Self-starters, you big fool. Drink your pint and be quiet. This brief comic interaction added some levity to the topic. The junk shop proprietor went on to joke that he could actually see the shelves for the first time, as they were normally coated in a layer of dust. His missus had always been nagging him about the dust, but Cecil happened to think that the blanket of fine particles added a certain ambience, a patina to the old junk shop. That was up for debate. However, what wasn't up for debate was his opinion of the teenager during those first 2 weeks he was at the shop. Mr. McIntyre went as far as saying, I can put my hand on my heart and say that I'd be a proud man if Blake Pierce was my son. He paused. Until, the third week rolled around. He shook his head, lost in thought. That poor devil got some notion into his skull during the second or third week. The lad changed, and we all know what happened in the fourth week. You're lucky to still have the place. It'd be a crying shame to lose all those priceless heirlooms. Cecil nodded in agreement, though he wasn't sure if the priceless items comment was an ironic one, and pronouncing heirlooms as heirlooms only added to the confusion. And nevertheless, everyone was listening now. The barman turned down the volume on the TV. A Mexican wave of somber nods moved along the counter, like bobbleheads on a dashboard. There wasn't a local in Oldcastle not aware of what happened to the boy in the fourth week of his tenure at the junk shop. But it was the third week that held the most mystery. A fellow drinker further up the counter asked, It changed in what way, Cess? Cecil McIntyre searched his pint of Guinness for an answer. The only way I can describe it, boys and girls, is that he was beginning to lose himself. You know, he kind of reminded me of a hopeless drug addict. Once an upstanding citizen of the community, but now robbing the same people he once helped. Uneasy chuckles came down the bar. The locals knew one or two people who had taken this darker path in life. Take Lonnie, for example. A beautiful young woman with everything to look forward to, until she met that gutter-snipe Dodd. He turned her into a zombie with his crystal meth. That waster lost his life under mysterious circumstances in the sewers beneath the streets of Oldcastle. But that's a story for another day. It all started with that odd look in his eyes. The second he laid eyes on that little figurine, he turned all dreamy. Everyone turned to Cecil, who had never spoken about the demonic statuette, the reason Blake Pierce was working at the shop. Well, you all know the lad was working at my place for a few weeks. But what you might not know is the reason he was there in the first place. He spotted a little figurine I took out of old Turner's place after he passed away, the archaeologist's place. That was the start of it, and only God knows where it will end. The other drinkers weren't too sure what Mr. McIntyre meant by that, but the troubled silence was unmistakable. One or two drinkers eyed the front doors of the Hound, imagining the crazed Pierce boy coming through those doors with fire in his eyes. No, I'm not saying that little piece of stone has anything to do with the young lad's mental break, but it had some kind of hold over him. He was fascinated with the thing. He wanted to buy it, and I told him I would reserve it for him if he worked up a few hours at the shop. Janie King, half-cooked on Heineken, joked that Cecil had always been a heartless businessman, taking advantage of school kids by charging them an arm and a leg for a piece of stone, while cleaning his shop and earning shit wages while he did it. Mr. McIntyre shot her down. "If you had been there, you might understand. And they weren't shit wages. If I was giving him shit wages, I'd be here till this time next year, waiting for the price of the figurine. I offered him a fair market wage. I run a business, and money talks. I knew it would take him forever to build up the asking price of €100 if he was doing odd jobs around." At this succinct juncture, half of the hound erupted in belly laughs. Cecil had some nerve charging an innocent teenager that kind of money for a piece of rock. Everything was plain sailing until the glass display case incident. The snorting laughter fizzled out. "But I believed his excuse. My missus told me I was a fool to believe him. But you know what? I wanted to believe him. I've come to that conclusion since the incident. And before Janie King asks me why, I'll tell you why. He was a nice kid." A tremble in his voice sneaked up on Cecil and surprised him. He found he couldn't control his jittering chin and lower lip and tried to hide his face in his pint glass as he took another sobering slug. He had grown very attached to the boy in such a short time. What he didn't want to tell the punters here tonight was that he held a secret ambition, a notion that some day Blake Pierce might carry on trade at Lost and Found, the long-lost son he never had. A sombre atmosphere came down in the pub like a cold mist. Dead air. With regret, the Lost and Found proprietor added, "He'd become a liability for a finish. One of us was going to get hurt. I had to give him his marching papers in the 4th week." Cecil paused for thought. "I suppose the sad irony in all of this is that he worked up the cash for the little statuette." Mr. McIntyre finished by saying, "Something got its teeth into him and wouldn't let go." He shook his head again, gulped down the dregs of his Guinness and called the barman for a fresh pint to wash the sour taste away. That was the last time Mr. McIntyre ever spoke about Blake Pierce, who was about to become Mr. Burns. "Found and lost, at Lost and Found," quipped Janie King at the far end of the counter. As agreed, Blake Pierce turned up at Lost and Found on Friday as per the schedule they had worked out between them. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Mr. McIntyre was waiting for him with a sweeping brush and pan. All Cecil had to do was point the boy in the right direction, and Blake zipped around the shop like a possessed man, mechanically working the brush, sweeping, gathering, sweeping, gathering. Once he had swept the floor, Mr. McIntyre handed the lad a feather duster and directed him towards the many shelves in the 2 areas of the shop and the glass display cases. The shop owner dealt with any customers who came in while Blake worked on the copious dust. That Monday afternoon, only 3 customers visited Lost and Found, and the second they left through the front door, Mr. McIntyre turned to the boy and complained, uttering the same line each time. "Curiosity never paid the bills. Curiosity killed the cat. Never forget that, Blake. Bloody window-shopping tourists is all they are. That's why we have all these, and God forgive my French, fucking mobile phone shops opening up on every street corner. They will be the death of this town in more ways than one. Mark my words. What's wrong with society?" Then Cecil would go into his spiel about how people who visit the shop are only there to snoop around and peruse the curiosities, but nobody's willing to put their money where their mouth is. "I'll hand over hard cash for the figurine once I work it up." The junk shop owner chuckled. "And I believe you will, Blake. I believe you're a man of conviction." He watched the Pierce boy work his way around the shop like a little tornado. Every now and again he would glance at the demonic stone in the display case, as if to make sure it was still there, and that reserve sign still firmly attached. A hint of shame pinched Mr. McIntyre just then. He had pulled that €100 price tag out of his hat, maybe overcharging the boy, and coupled that with poor wages. A part of him wanted to give the kid the damn figurine, but charity never paid the bills, and this might be a life lesson. Despite always wanting a child, Cecil and his wife weren't blessed with one, and it would be the closest he would come to giving a child a valuable life lesson. As they were coming up to 5 p.m., Blake, who had completed his chores, wandered over to the display case and stared through the glass at the demonic figure illuminated under the lighting. The more he stared at it, the more he was convinced that it was moving on its own, very slowly, across the glass towards him. So transfixed on the statuette, he wasn't aware that Mr. McIntyre was peering over the pages of the newspaper at him as he rocked gently back and forth in his rocking chair. The shop proprietor marvelled at how the boy was fascinated with the stone, staring at it, unblinking. At 5 p.m., Mr. McIntyre closed the shop and handed over hard-earned cash to Blake, who took it with a wide, pleased smile. They thanked each other and agreed to do it all again on the following Wednesday, same schedule. That Monday night, Blake Pierce dreamt about that red rusty stone. The demon, as Mr. McIntyre called it, during the REM phase of his sleep pattern. His eyes flickered back and forth behind his eyelids as the figurine pulsed and glowed. Its heat radiated on his face. The stone hummed when he had it safely tucked into the back trousers pocket of his dreams. It gave him unending hope, and its magic opened a whole new world to young Pierce. In that dream he could flap his arms, soar high through the clouds so nobody would see him, and blow fire from his mouth, just like a dragon. He could feel the flames hot on his lips, but never scorch his mouth because he himself was on fire, and flames cannot burn flames. Fire jetted from his agape mouth like it was coming from a fire extinguisher, only he was kindling the fire, not putting it out, by God. He soared high over the town of Oldcastle, plummeting through the clouds like a missile, spewing flames, burning the streets and whoever happened to be walking along those streets. The fiery blaze took out the shops too, every single premises, except the junk shop. In the dream, he dropped within 6 inches of the burning streets and sailed by the junk shop on Churchtown Road, lost and found. Inside, he caught a brief glimpse of Mr. McIntyre sitting in his rocking chair by the counter, reading his newspaper. The junk shop proprietor lifted his eyes from the local rag and waved at Blake, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was flying mid-air down the street and vomiting fire. With a smile on his face, Mr. McIntyre twiddled his fingers at Blake while the town burnt to the ground around him. When Blake woke in a blazing fever, he leaned out over the side of his bed, fully sure he was going to be sick. By the time 7:15 rolled around the following morning, the fever was gone, and Blake was full of life with thoughts of the figurine. It was as if he was the only one in on this big secret. Nobody else knew what powers that little piece of stone held. If he had to work the rest of his life for free at the junk shop, he would do it. The demon would be his, and Blake Pierce would be the demon's. Blake Pierce turned up on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. and repeated the same procedure he had done on Monday, sweeping, dusting, and general chores around the shop, though it had to be said that he did tend to hover about that glass display case. For now, Mr. McIntyre looked at this as an incentive for the lad. It reminded him of himself when he was Blake's age and how he worked at the local hardware store, sorting an infinity of screws and nails to pay for the bomber model aeroplane he had seen hanging in the window of Scanlon's toy shop down Maiden Street. It's gone now, like all the best of them. The town's character had left Oldcastle as far as Cecil was concerned. Now he had to look at those godforsaken phone case shop windows, everything designed to rip out a man's essence and soul. The town was sick, ailing, as his mother might have said, like a lot of towns across the country. Lost and found was a dying breed, and when Mr. McIntyre closed shop, he would take what was left of man's creative and curious side. And in the void, more retail premises dedicated to man's vices would sneak in to prey. Phones, phone cases, and the betting offices at the end of the rainbow. Everything designed to keep a man down. All designed to take money from the local slaves. Yes, Cecil might rob the eye out of your head if he thought you weren't antique savvy, but at least he was handing over an article of curiosity, a curio, and one could only wonder at its hidden history and what it had seen down through the years. Mr. McIntyre's items fired the imagination. God knows, maybe it would teach us all something in the year 2000. But the devil itself was moving into town as far as Cecil was concerned, taking money in its left taloned claws while killing you with its right-hooked slashers. But he normally held on to those rants for late-night beverages down at the Hound. Not that he knew it then, but a devil of a different breed was coming to town. When all was said and done, Mr. McIntyre was very impressed with Blake Pierce's work ethic, and it continued into the second week, the beginning of the second week, at least. By the time they got to Friday of that second week, Blake Pierce had grown distracted. Instead of his usual chores, he did nothing much except hang around the glass display case by the counter and gaze longingly at the figurine. Even standing close to the cabinet, Blake felt its pull and the allure of his dream. Cecil reminded the boy that he needed to complete his chores if he was to get paid. Cash towards the figurine. The reason you're here in the first place. You'll never have it if you don't start working, because I'm not paying you to stand around gawping at the figurine. It will always be on the other side of the glass. Considering Blake over his glasses with disapproving eyes, he handed the young man the sweeping brush and pan. Blake huffed a sigh and shuffled away to carry on with his chores. Cecil caught that sneer, fleeting, but the disgusted curl of the lip was there, a second of hatred in the boy's face, and it left Cecil cold. On Monday and Wednesday, Blake Pierce paced the junk shop with a dreamy gaze. Mr. McIntyre was constantly on him to get him moving, but Blake had no interest in working and loitered around the display case like a lovesick puppy. No, to be fair, that's not entirely accurate. Blake had a lot of interest in working, but only polishing and repolishing the glass display case holding the demonic stone. He polished and polished until he began to rub a hole in the glass. At least that's what Mr. McIntyre told him. And no sooner had he said this when a strange look came over Blake. It left Cecil numb, and for a fraction of a moment he didn't know who the young man was standing before him. He could have easily been a thief in to rob Mr. McIntyre of his precious things. Everything came to a head, pardon the unfortunate pun, on Friday of the third week at Lost and Found. It was just after 4 p.m. when Mr. McIntyre received the call from Limerick City Hospital telling him that his wife had been in a car accident and had fractured her skull. Not life-threatening, but his assistance was needed urgently at the hospital. Always waiting for that magic punter who never turned up, Cecil turned to Blake in a panic while grabbing his coat from the vintage coat perch by the door. Gotta go. Mags has been in a car accident. Now's your chance, Blake. I'm letting you in charge of the shop. Call around on Monday and I'll give you the rest of the cash and we'll call it quits, if you can manage not to screw up anything. Blake thought he was hearing things. He looked at Cecil with wide-eyed amazement. You mean I don't have to work next week? You'll just, give me the money? Pierce didn't mention Mr. McIntyre's wife. That should have been a red flag right there. But it was something Cecil didn't consider due to immediate circumstances. He didn't give the brief exchange any more consideration until he was giving the lowdown on the high stool at the Hound that night, when everyone listened intently to his side of the story. If you don't screw up, then yes, you have my word. While Cecil was answering, Blake was gazing at the stone with a burning desire. Blake, you heard me, right? The young man vaguely nodded. Uh-huh. The truth of the matter was that Mr. McIntyre couldn't stomach another afternoon in the presence of the boy. Moping around the shop, he was more than happy to let the dust build up than to have to look at that all afternoon. I'm not asking you to do anything. Just sit on that rocking chair there and wait until 5 p.m. Here. He handed him a spare key. Lock the shop. You can give it back to me on Monday. Blake took the key. So, we clear on everything? Young Pierce sat in the rocking chair and began to rock back and forth, gazing through Mr. McIntyre, which gave Cecil unending creeps. Rightio. He took that as his cue to leave. For some reason the hair stood on the back of his neck, and he wanted nothing more than to run, screaming, out of his own shop. Such was his hurry, Mr. McIntyre caught his overcoat in the door as he pulled it shut behind him. In a rush to get to his wife at the hospital, and having no desire to go back inside his own premises because of the creeping flesh he felt around Blake Pierce, Cecil simply ripped his overcoat, leaving a good strip of it inside the shop. It would be the last time he saw Blake Pierce. In his shop, at least. 3. No sooner had Mr. McIntyre left through the front door of the shop than Blake Pierce's eyes wandered back to the display case. He got up from the chair and approached the case. He eyed the lock on the door. If he could just find a way to slip that door open and take what was rightfully his, why, he would be doing justice to Mr. McIntyre. After all, he had already told him that he would give him money to buy the demon. All he had to do was sit and wait till 5 p.m. And that's exactly what Blake Pierce did. He sat himself in the rocking chair and rocked back and forth as the antique gingerbread clock on the counter counted down the seconds. Blake rocked back and forth like a metronome. Tick-tock, tick-tock. He seesawed himself into a trance while gazing at the rusty red statuette looking out at him, standing there on its hind legs, spewing fire at him, while its challenged T-Rex arms moved erratically, and its vampiric cape wings hugged its body. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick. As Blake Pierce rocked back and forth, he became acutely aware of time itself. And with each rock of the rocking chair only a measly second went by. Yes, he was on the countdown to 5 p.m., but then he would have to wait until Monday afternoon to get the money to pay for the figurine. That was already his. That didn't make much sense to him. A notion crossed his feverish mind, a notion that had already darkened his door as he watched flustered Mr. McIntyre catch his overcoat in the front door on the way out and tear the bloody thing in his rush to get away. What if, just what if, he were to take the figurine now and keep it safe for the weekend? Nobody would be at the shop to keep an eye on it. Nobody would miss it. What if a burglar broke in and stole it? What then? But he was back to square one. Blake had no key for the display case. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick. When 5 bells rang on the antique clock, he had no choice but to lock up the shop and go home. That evening his friends asked him to come out and ride their BMX bikes around town, but he couldn't stop thinking about the figurine in the darkness of the shop, all alone in the shadows. What if someone really did break in and steal everything? The demon was his, damn it, and nobody was going to take it away from him. He needed to make sure the figurine was okay, so instead of going out with his friends, Blake Pierce made a diversion to Churchtown Road. He had one thing in his pocket, the spare key to the shop. He parked his bike further up the street at the Texaco petrol station to avoid detection. If Mr. McIntyre happened to pass, he would see his bike, and those yellow rims were easy to spot. He didn't want him to worry. At least, that's what he had convinced himself of. But Blake had no business at the shop even a second after 5 p.m., especially at night. He let himself into the junk shop. It was strange to be in here at night. It felt like a different place. There wasn't a sound save for the steady tick-tock of the gingerbread clock. Blake made sure the blinds were twisted closed and went to inspect the figurine in the glass case. As always, it stared out at him, as if daring him to get closer. All that was separating them was a sheet of glass, and not very thick glass at that. Blake sat in the rocking chair by the display case. He began to rock back and forth, gently at first, then working up a good swing, to and fro. He rocked himself into another trance. Blake Pierce came to the conclusion that he needed the statuette in his hands. It was rightfully his. He had held up his side of the bargain, yet it was still locked away. That was unfair of Mr. McIntyre. But Blake had been nothing but fair with him, and just to show how much of a good sport he could be, he had decided while he was peddling over here tonight that he was going to let him keep the goddamn cash. This wasn't about money. He just wanted what was his. Yes, he had done all that work around the shop, and he'd done it for free. But the demon was payment enough. He searched the desk for a key but couldn't find one. Blake had been keeping an eye on Mr. McIntyre, trying to suss out where he kept the key for the display case. He caught sight of it once or twice and was sure there was only one key. He had even inspected the display case, determining whether there was another way to get in to retrieve his property. A weak point, perhaps. He rifled through papers in 4 different drawers, but no key. Blake sat himself into the rocking chair and rocked himself up into a strange delirium. That was when the idea came to him. He had seen the quartz collection on one of the shelves while dusting. It was a remote chance, but it was the only chance he had. He marched to the back of the shop and reached up onto the shelf and pulled down 3 lumps of quartz with large clear crystals. Mr. McIntyre had attached a discreet price tag to each rock. In geology class at school, Blake had learned, some useless information at the time, that quartz crystal can scratch glass. Never in a million years did Blake Pierce think he would ever use that information, but standing here tonight in Lost and Found, of all places, he decided to implement that useless information. He took the mid-sized quartz rock, which had the most pronounced crystals, perfect to work with, and began to scratch a rough circle into the side of the glass display case. A small, discreet hole would do it, just large enough to slip his hand through and remove the statuette. But 20 minutes and an aching wrist later, Blake Pierce was beginning to lose his patience. Maybe he had watched too many Mission Impossible films. But he was beginning to realize that it wasn't so easy to cut glass, and this glass was thicker than he'd first thought. And all the while, the demon was staring, daring him to come through the glass and take what was rightfully his. And that was when Blake Pierce was seized with a blinding fit of fury. Without even thinking about it, he picked up the lump of quartz and hurled it at the display case, full of rage now, and feeling very far from himself. The crash of shattering glass filled the shop. Blake briefly turned away to avoid any glass splinters. When he laid his eyes back on the case, he forgot to breathe on seeing the destruction. Glass shards were all over the shop, literally. The entire case had splintered like a broken windshield. He panicked, grabbed the figurine, shoved it down into his back pocket, and left himself out. Once outside, Blake was very careful to leave everything just as he had found it, not wanting to raise any suspicions, from the outside of the shop, at least. He trotted up Churchtown Road and grabbed his bike that was chained to the fence by the petrol station and beat a hasty retreat. As he pedalled home, he could feel the figurine warming him up from inside. And it was just like he was in a dream. But instead of flying, he was soaring along on his BMX. He wasn't spewing flames from his mouth, but his breath did fog out on this chilly night. As he raced home, all he could think about was fire and its beautiful abstract flames in all its fiery glory. 15 minutes later, Blake parked his bike outside his house and went inside. It was almost midnight. His parents were in the living room watching TV. As far as they were concerned, Blake had been out with his friends. They exchanged a few brief words and a good night. Blake went upstairs to his bedroom and slipped the statuette from his back pocket. It felt so good to have it, finally, in his hands. He lay on his bed and studied the red rusty demonic stone. He gazed at the stone flames coming from the creature's agape mouth and felt an uncontrollable urge to light his own flames, even if it was the only flame from a lit match. That's exactly what he did. Blake went downstairs to the kitchen, paused by the living room to see his parents watching TV, and grabbed a box of matches above the gas cooker. "Everything okay, Blake?" his mother asked from the living room. "Yeah, Mom." "If you're hungry, there's some corned beef in the—" But Blake was already gone back upstairs and didn't hear his mother's suggestion. He was hungry, not for food, but for fire. Blake didn't know why, but he yearned to see the demonic statuette in the glow of a flame, even if it was a poxy match flame. He switched off his bedroom light and sat on his bed. He placed the figurine on his bedside table, took a match from the box, and struck it along the brown strip. As he lit the match, with that first crack, he saw how the demon's shadow briefly lit up on the opposite wall by the door, 20 times the size of the statuette. The satisfying smell of sulphur rose in Blake's nostrils. He held out the match to the stone demon and looked on in amazement at how it appeared to come to life. Of course, it didn't literally come to life, because it was nothing but rock, but the flickering match casting the undulating light somehow resurrected the fire demon. He gazed dreamily until he flinched as the match burnt down and scorched the tip of his finger. Craving to see the giant demon on his bedroom wall just once more, he racked his brain, trying to think of a way he could bring the demonic creature to life on his wall. It didn't take long for him to remember the box of candles his mother and father kept in one of the kitchen drawers downstairs, just in case of an electricity failure. Leaving his bedroom once more, he tiptoed down the hallway and descended the stairs. Not once, during all of this, did Blake contemplate what he had done at the junk shop or the repercussions of his actions. It just didn't matter. The glass case was collateral damage, and that was that. Blake made a beeline for the kitchen, took a candle from the cutlery drawer below, then retreated back upstairs where he locked his bedroom door. He then cracked a match, lit the candle wick and tilted it, spilling some wax onto the bedside table. Blake then stood the candle up in the cooling wax. The illumination from the candle glowed on the figurine, casting a giant looming shadow on the bedroom wall. Blake sat back in the bed in awe as the giant demon on the wall wavered in the sputtering flame. Its wings pulsed, useless forearms jiggled, and the curled horns from its temples gave the illusion of movement. Fire. Blake flinched when he thought he heard someone whisper fire into his left ear, accidentally kicking the bedside table and knocking over the candle. The lit wick fell against the rusty red stone before the candle, and statuette rolled off the locker and onto the carpeted floor. What happened next happened in a flurry of confusion. Something took place in Blake Pierce's bedroom. Something he wouldn't be able to explain to anyone, simply because he didn't understand what or how it happened. The second that lit wick came in contact with the figurine, Blake heard a chilling chorus of high-pitched screams. From below his bed, a nightmare rose up before him. Two gigantic 6-foot leathery wings flapped open, each wing sporting a long single thumb and gripping claw, just like those of a bat. Then a set of horns curled in on its twisted grimace. Its balding head with lank strands of silver hair touched the ceiling. It crouched as it considered numb Blake Pierce, lying back in his bed with its white, full-moon eyes.
"I am Amon, and this is your baptism of fire."
The voice of the winged creature was cracked and dry as a high desert.
"Let the trial begin, torch carrier."
No sooner had it uttered those desiccated words when it opened its mouth and vomited flames. Blake leapt from the bed as it caught fire, then the curtains went up in racing red-hot streaks. For some reason, the noise thrown by those flames was more terrifying than the flames themselves for young Blake Pierce. The spreading fire jumped from his bed to the bedside locker. As the flames licked at the figurine, Blake thought he heard that hair-raising cacophony of shrill shrieking again, coming from somewhere he could not pinpoint. It was as if the burning flames themselves screeched high murder. Blake grabbed the figurine before the flames consumed it. He made to open the door, but he fumbled with the key while the fire engulfed everything behind him. His Metallica posters singed and curled, evaporating into nothing. Once his wardrobe went up, there was no turning back. That thing lit up like a gas tank. And as the flames took hold, a whoosh came from inside the closet as the air was sucked out of it by the inferno. The door frame caught fire. The flames piggybacked onto the door. Whatever paint coated Blake's door went up like plastic. Black, noxious fumes filled the bedroom. Blake choked and screamed to get out, but the door was on fire now, and the handle was red hot. He cursed and screamed again as his scorching skin singed on the metal handle. At this juncture, a pounding came from the other side of the door. Blake vaguely heard the distressed cries coming from his parents. One of them, probably his father, was throwing his weight into the door, thud after thud. The burning door shook in its door frame, but would not budge. A strange sensation came over the young man. Blake looked over his shoulder to see the nightmarish silhouette of the demonic presence standing still in the inferno, observing him from beyond the firestorm. A part of him didn't want his parents to bash the door down because they would come face to face with whatever Blake had let into their house. Right now, he was more afraid of his parents' reaction, especially his father's, than the abomination standing only feet behind him and not feeling any heat coming from the raging flames. And then it dawned on him. The window. He bounded past the hellhound that made no attempt to intervene, raised the window and leapt out onto the narrow windowsill. His bedroom was on the second floor, and the very hard front yard was below him. Blake grew dizzy as he focused on the concrete below the tips of his Dr. Martin boots. He looked back over his shoulder into his bedroom. The image of the creature standing there in the middle of the raging inferno would stay with him indefinitely. He didn't know it yet, but Blake Pierce suffered a mental break at that very moment when the supernatural fused with the natural. The sight of that otherworldly creature was enough to nudge him out onto the tip of the windowsill, close his eyes, and jump. The second Blake hit that cold, hard concrete, his ankles popped, cracked, and crumpled. It felt as if someone had taken an electric drill to the heels of his feet, drilling upwards through his leg bones with a long drill bit. Only then did the real horror sneak up on him as he realized he couldn't get to the front door to free his parents. He cried out for his mother and father to get out of the house, please, now. He pulled himself across the front yard, commando style, to the front door, but it was locked. Even if it wasn't, Blake wouldn't be able to reach up to the handle. By now the fire had spread to other rooms upstairs. A crash of glass rung out as the fire burst through his parents' bedroom window. Splintered glass rained down in deadly shards, crashing onto the concrete and barely missing young Pierce. In the distance, the approaching wail of sirens sounded through the night. The last thing Blake Pierce saw was a strange silhouette looking down at him from his parents' bedroom window, while the flames swirled around it. And then his world faded to black. 4. Blake Pierce woke in a hospital bed. Mild pain radiated from his ankle region, but was heavily dulled by strong medication. He was surprised to see 2 strangers in his room rather than his parents. It was only then when everything came rushing back to Blake. He could see the horror standing in his burning bedroom. "My parents! Are they okay?" "With our deepest condolences, Blake," the woman said. "Your parents didn't make it out of the house fire." "Blake, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Cindy. My name is Bart. We are police detectives, and we are trying to get to the bottom of what happened last night. I know this is very traumatic for you, but it's important that you tell us everything you know while it's fresh in your mind. We understand you're under heavy medication. You broke both ankles in a fall. Could you tell us how that happened?" Blake went on to explain how he had jumped from his bedroom window when the fire started. "And," interrupted the police detective named Bart, "as far as we're able to ascertain, the fire started in your bedroom. Would that be correct?" Blake nodded, and it was around about now when he started to feel that all wasn't as it seemed here in the hospital room. "How did the fire start, Blake?" the woman in the sharp suit asked. Blake took a deep breath, deciding the truth was best from here on in. "There was a demon." The police detectives exchanged a glance. "It came out of the statue, and it set fire to my bed." Cindy probed. "Were you playing with fire in your room?" Suddenly Blake felt this was going in a direction he wasn't ready for. "Yes, I lit a match and a candle. Why are you asking me this question? I wasn't playing with fire. It wasn't like that." "Why did you light a candle?" asked the male detective. Blake knew exactly why he had lit the candle, but how was he going to explain that to the police detectives? "Just tell the truth," he told himself. "Because I wanted to see the demon shadow on the wall." Another brief glance passed between the detectives. "How did the fire start, Blake?" Bart asked. "The demon started it. It blew fire from its mouth, like a dragon." "Demons and dragons," said Bart. "Why does that sound familiar?" "No, wait. I'm thinking about Dungeons and Dragons. Video game." The woman asked, "Did that candle fall over, by any chance?" He didn't like their line of questioning. It was as if they knew what had happened, but wanted him to see it. They had already made up their minds. "No, well, yes. That wasn't what started the fire." With a surge of panic now, he exclaimed, "There was a demon in my bedroom." "Uh-huh." Police Detective Bart stared at the floor, unable to bring his eyes to Blake. "Like I said, it came out of the little statue." "A statuette?" asked the man. "Rusty-coloured and demonic?" "Yes," Blake rejoiced. "Do you know it?" "Why would it be in your possession, Blake?" Bart asked. "Which brings me nicely to my next question. Were you anywhere near the," checking his notes, "lost and found junk shop in Oldcastle last night?" "That's an and with one of those squiggly things like, it's called an ampersand." Cindy cut in briskly. "And I don't think it really matters, maybe? I mean, there can't be that many junk shops in Oldcastle going by the name of Lost and Found, with an ampersand." She turned to Blake. "So, let's cut to the chase, Blake, shall we? We know a lot more than you think we know. For example, we have spoken to the junk shop owner, checking her notes again, Mr. McIntyre. He told us that you were the only one with the spare key because his wife was in a car accident and he had to leave the premises in a hurry. He asked you to close up for him. Is all of this correct?" He began to sweat. "No, yes, I worked there part-time for a few weeks." When she asked, "Any particular reason you were working there?" Blake answered with, "I wanted to buy something in the shop, so Mr. McIntyre offered me a few hours in the evenings after school, cleaning, brushing, that kind of thing." That way I could earn money to buy the demon." "Interesting," commented Cindy, "because somebody broke into the shop last night and destroyed one of the glass display cases. There was only one item taken. The same item you're describing, the, demon. You didn't steal the figurine, Blake, by any chance?" There was a touch of sarcasm in her tone. "No, no way. I'm naked, and they can see through me." "Blake," said the man, "I think it's time you started to tell us the truth. Like my partner said, we have surveillance video clearly showing yourself entering the premises last night, well after closing time. Don't give us any more bunkum." "Bunkum," repeated Cindy. "I haven't heard that. This is all just a game to them. They aren't taking me seriously. Word for a long time. My mother used to use that single-worded reply when I gave her excuses about climbing out my window at the weekend when I was grounded. I couldn't open the door, Mom. It was stuck. Bunkum. I thought the window was the door because I was sleepwalking. Bunkum." She turned to Blake. "Speaking of climbing out windows and being grounded, literally grounded, had you already planned to jump out the window after setting fire to your house, after stealing from the shop? We know that you parked your bike at the Texaco petrol station to avoid detection. You then tailed back to the shop, committed the crime, then you bolted for your BMX and you cycled home with the wind at your back. Isn't that right, And before you answer, Blake, we want you to know that you've been recorded on numerous cameras throughout Old Castle. The camera never lies. I'm throwing you a lifeline here, Blakey, me old bucko. The last thing you need now is extra time behind bars for lying. The judge will take this into consideration when handing down your sentence." Blake broke out in a cold sweat on hearing these scary words. "The demon called me to the shop. It was the demon that set fire to the house." Blake's eyes widened as he recalled something that might save him. He was able to put a name on that demon. Amon. He said its name was Amon. That surely gave him credibility. "Wait, I'm confused. Is that the name of the demon you stole from the shop, or the one that burnt your house down?" Bart asked. The truth of the fact was that Blake wasn't sure either. "I don't know, but I didn't steal the figurine. I had a key to the shop. Mr. McIntyre gave it to me himself." Cindy responded with, "He might have given you a key, but what he didn't give you was permission to go back into the shop after hours, Blakey, me old bucko." "Cindy," Bart cut in with a warning tone. This wasn't the first time his partner showed a lack of respect towards a suspect they were questioning. "Blake." Bart smiled a smile that reached too far across his face for comfort. "We're on your side. You need to tell us what really happened so we can clear this up and help you, because right now we're all you've got." Cindy butt in. "I will give you one thing. It took some balls of titanium, I would say, to jump out that window knowing that you were going to break your ankles. It gave you the perfect excuse." "The perfect excuse for what?" Blake bawled. "You were not able to get to the doors to let your parents out." Blake's world began to spin. He thought he was going to be sick. He levered himself up onto his elbows, leaned over the side of the bed and retched. And when he laid his eyes back on the detectives, there was nobody there but the demonic entity standing over his bed, watching him with those lifeless lunar eyes, and was gone just as fast. Blake screamed, "Okay, yes, I stole the statue, but Mr. McIntyre told me that I already had it anyway. I was just taking what was rightfully mine." Bart asked, "By smashing the glass display case, what got into your head, Blake? What was the emergency?" "The demon got inside my head." "Bingo! Bingo!" Cindy declared. "Now we're cooking pancakes. Finally the truth. Thank you, Blake." She nodded approvingly at her colleague. Bart, not being the brightest light on the Christmas tree, didn't follow. "A demon inside his head is the truth?" His partner answered cryptically, "It's the truth for him." Bart's scowl told Cindy that further enlightenment was necessary. Then something happened that sent Blake Pierce's mind into a flurry of mayhem. The male detective propped the rusty red figurine on the overbed table, right in front of Blake. He seemed to pull it out of thin air like a magician. The teenager let out a panicked cry and pulled himself as far back in his bed as he could until he was squashed up against the headboard. "Get it away from me! You need to get rid of it. Where did you get it?" Cindy answered, "One of the hospital staff. She found it stuffed into your back pocket when she was getting you into your fetching hospital gown." Bart threw his colleague another disapproving glance before turning back to the young man. "Blake, I just want to show you that your story doesn't add up." Before Blake could stop him, the detective took a cheap plastic lighter out of his left jacket pocket, flicked the spark wheel, and held the copious flame to the figurine. He kept it there, running the flame over the stone body of the demonic entity. The detective studied the boy's face for a reaction, relishing in the fear they were instilling. "So, where is the bogeyman, Blake, Bart asked, peering about the hospital room with mock conviction. The distressed young man could barely bring his eyes to look about the room, unable to turn his head, numb with fear. Cindy leaned over and took his hand in hers. "Blake, listen. You have your whole life ahead of you. I have a son roughly your age, and I know that teenage years can be horrible. I struggled through my teenage years. I could tell you stories that would make your toes curl, but," looking at her partner, "that's for another day. Look around you, Blake. We are at the hospital where it is safe. But," she paused, "further tests need to be done. But this isn't the hospital to do it. We're going to recommend they transfer you to the hillside. Do you know it?" "I'm not a loony!" Blake's response told him that he was very aware of the psychiatric facility. "Blake, we have established that there is no demon, except the one looking at you on the table there." Bart chuckled. "Many elements in this case don't add up. It needs to be determined whether you set that fire on purpose or if it was an accident." "It was neither. How many times do I have to tell you?" The detective continued to speak over him. "Now, I don't know if we have already mentioned this, but what you say here will be used and held against you in the court of law, should it come to that." Cindy joined in. "Now that we have the demon part of the story cleared up, Blake Pierce, did you start the fire on purpose or was it an accident?" Blake was in a tight spot and never felt so alone in all his life. This was made all the worse by the fact that his parents were standing over there in the corner, smoke rising out of their heads and holding their silence, which was the worst of all. "Accident." "Sorry, we didn't catch that," said Bart. "Speak a little louder so my recorder can pick it up." Blake hadn't even known they were recording the whole thing. "Accident. So, just to be clear, you didn't light the fire on purpose?" Not for the first time, Blake was genuinely confused. "I don't think so," Bart responded. You see, Blake, that's not going to hold in a court of law. You either did or you didn't." For the first time at the hospital, and probably in his entire life, Blake thought about those around him. More specifically, their safety. What if he had set the house on fire on purpose? "I'm not sure." At this juncture, Cindy stood up and asked to have a word with her colleague in the hallway. Outside, she said, "He's deranged, Bart. He needs to be put away in a place where people know how to deal with this. I knew it the second I saw him. He has all the hallmarks of schizophrenia or some other mental illness of the delusional variety. Did you not see it in his eyes? Those eyes give me the creeps, Bart. Oh, Jesus, they give me goosebumps." She pulled up her jacket sleeve to reveal pale, goose-fleshed skin. "You know why his eyes are the way they are?" This juncture was spiked with Blake Pierce's voice crying from inside the room. Bart vaguely shook his head. In reality, he hadn't seen any of the madness she spoke of in the teenager's eyes. "Because they've seen horrors, Bart. Horrors that were never meant to be seen, except by Blake Pierce. Haunted by horrors that were never there to begin with. But he did see them. This demon creature was very real to him. But in reality, the only demon here was that pathetic little statue he stole from the shop and the one in his head that told him to burn his house down with his parents in it. Somewhere along the way, that stone demon and the one in his head fused to become one." "I should be a psychiatrist in a psychiatric hospital. What do you think?" "I think you should be in a psychiatric hospital, Cindy." Now, the next issue we have is whether he did this on purpose or is genuinely suffering from a mental disease that told our little pyromaniac to do it. He will need psychiatric evaluation to decide whether he is fit to stand trial, and that trial will decide Blake's future. What we can be sure of is this: Lucifer didn't strike that match or light that candle. Blake Pierce's cries of protest continued unabated in the background. It was painful to listen to. Amon. Yes, I agree. No truer words. I think amen sums up the whole situ. No, I mean Amon. She studied him for a second. Are you speaking Jamaican by any chance? No, that was the name he gave the demon. Cindy raised her eyebrows. Whatever, Bart. Just whatever. We have enough on our plate now with imaginary demons, besides giving them names. Oh, please. Personally, I think he's in the wrong hospital. I think he should be at the hillside. You know the one. The psychiatric facility out there on the coast road. I'm going to recommend his immediate transfer. There's no more they can do with his ankles here. They just need to mend. The sudden silence from inside the room never dawned on the police detectives, until the scream came. And that was followed by the nurse coming through the doors in pale-faced panic. She ran past them and down the hallway, never looking back. Bart and Cindy looked at each other in dismay before looking back into the room. Meanwhile, back in the hospital room, young Blake Pierce was almost delirious, unsure what was real and what wasn't. The police detective's reaction had caused him to doubt himself. The demon that materialized in his bedroom was as real as the demon figurine he'd stolen. And, oh dear Jesus, his parents were holding hands and looking at him in silence with a questioning gaze, yet they hadn't come through the door. Don't look at me like that, whispered Blake. The nurse turned from her table of medicines. I didn't look at you, Blake. I'm busy here whipping up a concoction, she added in a breezy way, yet kept her back to him as she prepared something away from Blake's wandering eyes. Not you, he muttered, barely audible. My parents are here. Look at them. They're holding hands. I've never seen them holding hands. That's a beautiful thing. No matter how hard the nurse tried to appear genuine, she came off as mocking. It was only now when Blake saw the smoke tendrils curling upwards from the tops of Mom and Dad's heads, yet they didn't seem to realize. But what he realized was the harmless little figurine, Mr. McIntyre's, the demon, had possessed him in some strange way, circling him out as the one who would take part in this trial by fire. Baptism of fire! Blake cried out suddenly. The nurse flinched, pricking her left hand with the syringe in her right hand. The last thing she wanted to do now was knock herself out as well as the teenager. After the night shift she'd put down, it wouldn't take too much to put her to sleep. That's what happened to the house, Blake pleaded. My baptism of fire. That's okay, Blake, soothed the nurse, but her flippancy only made things worse. Blake roared, It told me this would be my trial by fire. Something about me being a torch carrier. Shh, yes, Blake. Don't worry about that. The nurse smiled. Behind her back she held a dripping syringe containing 3 milligrams of midazolam. Mom, I didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. The candle fell over and by now, in his distracted state, young Blake Pierce wasn't sure anymore if that candle he had lit actually fell on his bed and set fire to his bed sheets, or maybe it really had fallen on the little table by his bed, as he had said, but didn't land on the figurine but on the neck scarf he had draped over his bedside lampshade. He liked the ambience in the room, but the iron fist of his father had warned him against the neck scarf several times, advising him to take it off the lampshade because some night the whole thing was going to go up in fire. And if he was being honest with himself, Blake had smelt burning plastic coming from the lamp, but like a lot of things, did sweet fuck all about it. Now look at what you've gone and done, his father said with that silent, unrelenting gaze that was now a dare stare. I dare you to look at me, son. You see, you can't because your guilty conscience won't let you. Now all of this was coming home to roost in this damned house of confusion. Blake Pierce thrashed and writhed in his hospital bed despite the stabbing pain in his ankles, demanding the police detectives listen to him and take him seriously. The nurse smiled, but only her mouth was smiling. Her eyes were cold. It was only when she was next to him that he noticed the needle. As she brought the needle tip to his flesh, Blake's arms suddenly seized up, along with the rest of his body turning petrified rigid. "Please relax. Don't be so tense. You will feel the needle if you don't relax your muscles." The boy's agape mouth appeared to want to say something, but opened and closed like the mouth of a drowning goldfish. "It's just something to help you sleep. You're going to give yourself a heart attack." And speaking of heart attacks, the nurse sensed someone standing behind her. She turned to look over her right shoulder and upwards at the abhorrent thing standing over her and blocking out the light. It must have been 12 feet tall, with flexing leathery wings that made a slight flapping sound, and the redundant thumb and claw sticking from those wings made it even more detestable. The twisted broken horns coming from its temples put it in a category of its own. Its skin reminded the nurse of reptilian skin, and in some areas of its naked body whole chunks of flesh flapped loosely from its frame. But it was the eyes of the thing that left the nurse paralyzed, as if she had just mistakenly stuck herself with one of her own needles.
"I am Amon, and you have failed in this trial by fire."
Those ethereal full moon eyes on the boy in the bed were more than enough to prompt the nurse to run screaming from the room. And to hell with the kid who wasn't deranged after all. There was a 5-second gap between the nurse bolting from the room and the two detectives reappearing, and what they found was Blake Pierce lying in bed, held in a strange catatonic state. Slowly, he turned to them. Something had happened in the intervening seconds, and if Cindy thought Blake had a strange glint in his eye before, then now he was a fully qualified patient for the hillside. Epilogue. Blake Pierce would spend the rest of his life in and out of the Hillside Psychiatric Hospital, but would never again see the demon Amon. It wouldn't be long before another patient called him Mr. Burns one night during an Atlantic storm. The nickname stuck like melting plastic. Blake never looked at himself as a mental patient, but rather an artist. Some would say there wasn't much of a difference. Mr. Burns liked to make fierce and furious abstract art, and the raging flames were his fiery canvas. The man was quite deranged. The professionals at the psychiatric facility would unanimously agree that Blake Pierce, a.k.a. Mr. Burns, was a perfect example of what it is to be a pyromaniac, a slave to the flame, and always had been, right back to that night when he set fire to the house and killed his parents in the fire. He got away with it on grounds of insanity. For that reason alone, the brain doctors recommended the fine artist have a permanent residency at the psychiatric facility out on the coast road. Ironically, the tumultuous Atlantic Ocean would prove to be a major source of inspiration for Mr. Burns, especially on stormy nights when the salt from the ocean came up the cliffs on the whipping winds. Blake, a.k.a. Mr. Burns, liked to stick his tongue out and taste the salt coming through his barred window. In 2023, a fire broke out on the B wing of the hillside. The fire started in Mr. Burns' room. Forensics indicate that he set fire to himself in his ultimate fiery, cannibalistic masterpiece. His final resting place can be visited today in the cemetery on the outskirts of Oldcastle. R.I.P. in loving memory of Blake Pierce, 1985 to 2023. Some joker in town later added in with permanent marker, "May your flame burn bright."